Here at Duquesne University. It is with great pleasure that I welcome all of you to the Social Justice Research Symposium sponsored by the Sociology Club here at Duquesne University. As faculty advisor to the Sociology Club, I've had the distinct pleasure of working with a group of very energetic and ambitious young persons in the Department of Sociology. And they have put together an amazing week-long campus-wide symposium for their peers. On our campus today, we have many students who are committed to a better future, one that is more just for everyone. Students from the Sociology Club with this event raise the question to their peers as we succeed into future roles of privilege and power. How will we do things differently? With this symposium, there are 4 objectives. The first is to celebrate student commitment and passion for social change and social justice. It is also to showcase student research and student action work related to social justice. The symposium will also unite students with faculty scholars and experts with lived experience from our local communities. In addition, the symposium is designed to prepare our students, to prepare them for the work that lies ahead.
I haven't sat here last time.
It will expand students' knowledge, their understanding, and their skills related to social justice scholarship and action. This event is not only reflective of our current student body's interests and desires for a better future, it is also part of a longer term agenda and mission here at Duquesne University. It reflects the sociology department's mission to use science to improve society. It reflects the College of Liberal Arts' mission to prepare students for productive and creative lives in a rapidly changing world. It also exemplifies the university's broader mission to serve God by serving students. And importantly, it echoes the Catholic ethos that implores us to walk with those at society's margins. The Sociology Club students whose hard work over the past 7 months has resulted in the program that you all are going to see this week include the club's president, Deidra Hubay, the club's secretary, Sydney Yates, and the club's treasurer, Alex Loisinecki. Before I yield the podium to the club's president, can we all please join in a round of applause for the students whose hard work has brought this amazing program to fruition?
And thank you so much. And also, we couldn't have done this without Dr. Appelt's support and guidance. So if we could give her a quick round of applause too. So good morning, everyone. And once again, welcome to the 2021 Social Justice Research Symposium, or SJRS for short. My name is Dee Hubay. As mentioned, I'm a member of the Symposium's Planning Committee, the Sociology Club's president, and a student of the 4-to-1 Applied and Public Sociology program here at Duquesne Liberal Arts School. Together with our faculty advisor, Dr. A, and my co-organizers, Sydney Yates, Alex Loisinecki, and Kendall Nasiadka, we have worked diligently over the last months to bring this week to life. It's truly been a team effort and encouraging student research, expert panel discussions, and we're going to empower attendees to participate in social justice in their daily lives. You might be wondering why we wanted to put together a social justice research symposium. As Dr. Appelt so eloquently explained, our generation of students is next in the line of succession for positions of relative power. Not only is it important for our generation of students to take action in such a way that will result in positive and sustainable progressive social change, but as students, and especially those as sociologists, we know all too well that while taking action towards social change is both important and necessary, taking uninformed action could actually end up doing more harm than good. And thus, in an effort to tackle this issue head on, the idea for the Social Justice Research Symposium was born. Throughout the course of this week, we will be hosting, throughout the course of this week, we hope to provide you with a wide variety of educational opportunities that leave you feeling inspired to take informed action towards social justice in your everyday lives, both on campus and in our community. Please keep in mind that all events this week will be hosted on campus, but will also be broadcast via Zoom. All events will take place here in this room in 613, except for on Friday, it'll be in room 119 on the first floor. You can view any of our sessions online via Zoom by going to symposium.forager1.com/SJRSS so that you can access the Zoom links for each session. Also available to be viewed on the Forager One platform are all student research poster presentations. Our students have worked very hard to put these together, and we'd be grateful for your support in viewing their research and perhaps taking a few moments to comment on some of their research. To kick off our week for today's theme of Common Ground Day, we'll be having a keynote address by Dr. Cindy LaCom of Slippery University, following the conclusion of our opening remarks. This lively and engaging presentation is called Intersectional Advocacy, Working Together to Find Common Ground. This afternoon, Dr. Jessica Mann from the Center of Community Engaged Teaching and Research will host a diverse panel discussion of student leaders entitled Leadership in Common Ground in a Social Justice Context. On Tuesday, we will celebrate Identity and Inclusion Day with a morning session featuring student research presentations related to the day's theme, followed by an afternoon panel discussion entitled Stigma and Identity, an Interdisciplinary Discussion, featuring Dr. Cathleen Appelt, Dr. Megan Blaskowitz, Dr. Norman Conti, and Dr. Tammy Hughes. On Wednesday, or Local Justice Day, we will have a morning session featuring student research presentations related to social justice that affect the Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania regions, followed by an afternoon panel discussion by Duquesne's Place Lab and Dr. Eva Sims and Lucas Goodwin. The Place Lab focuses on researching the intersection of community, nature, and place in collaboration with community organizations that steward local green spaces. On Thursday, we will celebrate Structural and Institutional Impacts Day by beginning with a morning session featuring, again, student research presentations. And in the afternoon, we will host a panel discussion entitled Transition and Reentry, Life After the Institution, which will explore the overlaps and differences between individuals returning home from incarceration and returning home from military service. That panel will feature myself, Hassan Stevens, Tylee Thompson, Veronica Watkins, Jamar Williams, and Dr. Gretchen Haas. We will conclude our week with Friday's Action and Resistance Day. The morning session, entitled Finding Hope and Inspiration, Taking Action in Social Justice, will feature a series of TED-style talks moderated by Dr. Matthew Schneirov, and will include talks by him, Dr. Michael Irwin, myself, Ethan Horn, and Rachel Means. In the afternoon, we will host a panel on the topic of resistance, moderated by Sydney Yates, featuring local community activist Yusef Jonas, and nonpartisan researchers and scholars, Dr. Jenny Scholes and Dr. Norman Conti, with brief closing remarks and a student perspective on activism. We hope that these sessions will leave students and community members prepared to tackle social justice in their research and daily lives. Before we kick off the week, there are a number of people we would like to thank for helping us make this event a reality. I'm going to turn the stage over to the Secretary of the Sociology Club, one of my closest co-organizers, Sydney Yates, to express our gratitude for those who helped make this week possible.
Good morning. Firstly, as briefly mentioned, we would like to thank the entire Symposium Planning Committee and especially Dr. Cathleen Appelt. We truly could not have done this without her help. For the past few months, she has met with us weekly, answered late night emails, and always had invaluable insights to contribute. Her ability to see the big picture, make connections, and guide us as we attempted such an undertaking for the first time certainly impacted both students and the outcome of the event. Dr. A, Thank you so much for your dedication and for helping us so much over the past few months. We really couldn't have done this without you. We would also like to thank the session organizers for this event: Ethan Horn, Kendall Nazadka, Taylor Kotler, Dr. Anne-Marie Pop, and Dr. Anita Zuberi for ensuring setup and the organization of student research presentations. In addition, we would like to thank the entire sociology department, especially the chair, Dr. Matthew Schneiroff, not only for his agreed participation in this event, but also for allowing the department to sponsor 2 student research awards. We also extend our gratitude to Dr. Sarah McMillan, Director of the Peace, Justice, and Conflict Resolution Minor Program, for providing an award for student research. In that same vein, we extend a special thank you to the Center for Engaged Teaching and Research for providing an award for community engagement. We would also like to thank the Dean of the McAnulty College and Graduate School of the Liberal Arts, Dr. Christine Blair, as well as her social media coordinator, Kathleen Kenna. These individuals have provided a great amount of support for this event, and for that we are very grateful. We owe a tremendous thank you to the Center for Community Engaged Teaching and Research for their incredible support for this symposium. Dr. Jessica Mann, Dr. Lucy Jo DiMaggio, and Deanna Frakel have helped us so much throughout the planning process and have been essential in bringing the week's events to life. Not only did CEDAR so graciously sponsor a student research award, but the office also sponsored presenter roundtable luncheons. We are very grateful for their help. Mary McConnell, Christine Pollack, and Luke Fabiziak from the Office of Research and Innovation have also provided a great amount of advice and support for the planning committee, as well as the ability to use the Forger One platform. We are so grateful to them for helping us make this a hybrid event and allowing us to reach a larger audience. Mary McConnell has helped provide invaluable support and guidance through the entirety of this process, and we hope that attendees will also mark their calendars for the graduate and undergraduate research symposium held by the Office of Research and Innovation next semester in April of 2022. We would also like to thank Mark Grandillo and the Center for Student Involvement and Sarah Murtha from Conference and Event Services. We could not have done this without all of their contributions and assistance in this week's events, and they are also owed a massive debt of gratitude. We'd also like to thank all of our guest speakers and expert panelists planned to present this week. We know that your contributions will greatly benefit our students by providing them with the tools and insights needed to kickstart their journeys on the path to social justice. Lastly, we would like to thank all of the students who submitted research abstracts for this event. We applaud your commitment to scholarship, research, and social justice. We hope that this week will provide you with the opportunity to celebrate your research, receive feedback, and learn from your fellow students about a variety of social justice topics. Before turning the stage over to Dr. Cindy LaCom, please join us in a quick round of applause and special thank you for all those who have made this event possible.
Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Cindy LaCom, Director of the Gender Studies Program and member of Interdisciplinary Studies Department at Slippery Rock University. Cindy earned their PhD from the University of Oregon in 1993 and has taught at Slippery Rock University for 25 years. They integrate gender and feminist issues into their teaching and scholarship and have a specific interest in disability studies. My organizers and I have met Cindy through the Elsinore Benu Think Tank for Restorative Justice, where Cindy serves as an active organizing member. Over the past year, I've had the honor and opportunity to work alongside Cindy on a multitude of projects, including the Voices for Juvenile Justice Conference taking place March 4th and 5th, 2022. We are so incredibly lucky to have Cindy here today to kick off our week's events with their talk entitled Intersectional Advocacy, Working Together to Find Common Ground. And without further ado, I would like to turn the stage to Dr. Cindy LaCom.
It's very odd to both look at the room and to look into the camera. I want to give another round of applause to the symposium organizers and to everybody who is participating. I think this is an incredible event. Dee, I thought of something that you said when you said that activism that is not informed is potentially problematic. And when you and I first began talking about finding common ground, one of the questions I wanted to ask was, how do we best do this? How do we do it effectively? And how do we do it with cultural humility and cultural competency? So that's to some extent what I plan my talk around today. So welcome, and I'm going to ask some of the stuff I had planned to do in small groups. I think we may do as a facilitated discussion. I would ask people who are joining us by Zoom, if you want to just unmute yourself, or if you want to raise your hand, and Dee or Sid, perhaps you could just let me know.
Here, so I can address them.
Okay, and just this way.
I can click.
It's not. Thank you. All right, so some of the outcomes we're hoping to get to today. The first is to understand and review the concept of intersectionality. And because you are social justice advocates, most of you are probably familiar with this term. So bear with me if we have some review, and if you're really familiar with it, here's a chance to show off. To understand the benefits of affinity groups and strategic essentialist politics, which seems to fly in the face of finding common ground, but I want to at least address why it's important. To apply an intersectional lens to one specific issue, actually, that I've kind of prepared, and to see some of the common ground that's there. Apply concepts of intersectional allyship, and a phrase that I'm going to be using from a feminist legal scholar, Nancy Tuana, is to understand epistemologies of ignorance, which really goes back to what Dee said, which is that we can only be the best social justice activists when we're informed. And finally, to apply concepts of intersectionality to current issues in terms of activism, advocacy, and finding common ground. Why am I having such a hard time with this? Okay, intersectionality. So some of you are familiar with this. It's a coin that was termed by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's also a legal feminist scholar. She used the term in 1991 in an essay that she published called Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity, Politics, and Violence Against Women. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context for that, but one of the things that she said in this article was that if we can't name a problem, we can't see it. And if we can't see a problem, we can't solve it. So one of the first challenges for us really is to name the problem. And as somebody who comes out of the Department of English 1,000 years ago, I believe deeply that language constructs reality, and that being able to name an issue makes it more real. So what happened with Crenshaw was she came across a case of a woman whose name was Emma de Graffenried. Emma de Graffenried filed a civil lawsuit against General Motors on the grounds that she'd been denied a job as a Black woman. And what General Motors said was, that's just not true. We hire Black people and we hire women. And that, in fact, was true. GM did hire white women as clerical staff, and they did hire Black men as workers really doing the kind of worst jobs, but they weren't hiring Black women. She filed 2 different suits. She lost them both. GM did win, but Crenshaw, in studying this, realized that what was happening was that there was no real way to address the problem of this intersectional bias that de Graffenried was facing as a Black woman. So as a woman who was Black, she was facing sexism differently than white women. And as a Black woman, she was dealing with racism in a way quite different than that of her male colleagues. So intersectionality.
I'm very sorry. Can I interrupt? I'm so sorry. We can't see your presentation on Zoom. Would you mind sharing the screen?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for actually pointing that out. That's good.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just would like to see the slides. Thank you.
Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I love it when disembodied voices tell me that I'm doing something that's a mistake. I do appreciate that. So the definition, most simply, of intersectionality is overlapping and interlocking systems or structures of oppression. So a Black woman might face intersectional oppression. And this was a point at which I was going to ask, can you think of any other examples? And again, people who are participating via Zoom, if you want to simply unmute yourself, can you think of any other examples of intersectional oppression that someone might have to face? Remember, this is the interactive part. Yeah.
I think that police brutality, you often see Black men get the media coverage, and there are Black women experiencing the same kind of violence, and it doesn't get the same sort of coverage.
That's an excellent point. So Black men are dealing with police violence and they're getting a lot of coverage. And actually Crenshaw talks a little bit about that in her TED Talk, right? But Black women are often erased or negated from public media reports of police violence. One other group I'm going to say in intersectional terms, when we think of state violence, is people with disabilities. There was a recent case, Owensby, a young Black man who is a quadriplegic, was pulled over by the police. He had left a house that had been targeted for drugs. When they pulled him over, and he had a child in the backseat of his car, he immediately said, "I'm a quadriplegic." When they said, "Get out of the car," he said, "I cannot get out of the car." They said, "Get out of the car." They finally pulled him out of the car by his hair, pulled him onto the ground, and eventually arrested him. That's an incident of intersectional oppression because he is experiencing oppression as a Black male with a disability. Okay, good. The last point I'd make before we move on is that it's really important to remember with intersectionality that it's structural, it's not individual. So if I don't like people with beards, that's Cindy LaCom's weird thing. It's not structural oppression. It's got to be part of a systemic issue. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit. Wait a second. About affinity groups and essentialist identity politics. So what is an affinity group? The most simple answer is it's a group that is linked by a common interest, purpose, or identity. I know that this topic is called finding common ground, but before we get there, I want to ask the question, can you think of any benefits to an affinity group? Especially in political terms, especially in terms of social justice. When might it make sense for a group of people who have something in common to work together? And what might be the benefits? Yes, Dee.
I think that it might be good for groups to work together, especially when there's a marginalized group that is trying to gain a lot of traction in some area, like when we look at the civil rights movement. While this is clearly a Black or person of color issue, we really needed buy-in from mostly white men in order to make and advance progress on that area, because they were the people who were already in those positions of power.
All right, and many of us, when we think of the civil rights group, actually think primarily of African Americans. And in many ways, that is a social justice cause that was driven by African Americans. In some ways, that was necessary to really create the cause and then attract other people. So I want to just say one of the I don't know. Okay, got it. While it might seem divisive, what is one benefit? The reality is that we are already divided by structural bias, right? I mean, to pretend that that doesn't happen, to say something like I'm colorblind or I don't see gender, I don't see sexual identity, expression, orientation, is to me personally kind of offensive, because of course it's still there. And the people who tend to say that they don't see something are the ones speaking from positions of privilege, right? Affinity groups can also provide a sharp focus on a desired outcome. I think that this is the case because I think a lot of times people who are oppressed know best what they want to change. And an outside perspective may think they know, but it is often practicing a kind of colonization. It's often an affinity group provides a place of greater security and safety for marginalized folks. It may be that if I am facing structural oppression, I don't feel comfortable talking about a comment that is a microaggression or a comment which is ableist in its basis, but I might feel very comfortable if I'm talking to other people who experience, for instance, social anxiety. And finally, this leads arguably to a greater space for authenticity and honesty. And sometimes if you're part of a marginalized group, you just need that space. So there are a lot of benefits. And I wanted to ask, again, can you think of any examples of essentialist identity politics? You talked about 1D, which is at least the origins of the civil rights movement. Can you think of any others? Or essentialist identity politics? And let me really give you a clear definition of that. It's when a group of people bond together temporarily for a specific amount of time to achieve a specific outcome or end. Can you think of any other examples? Yeah.
Women's suffrage.
Women's suffrage is a great one. So it was made up primarily of women. And one of the myths, of course, is that it was made up primarily of white women. It was actually a fairly intersectional group, though history has rewritten it so that white women get most of the credit. And though there were men who participated in the women right for women's suffrage, how many would agree this is primarily essentialist identity politics? And after 1920, many of the women who had worked together went their separate ways. Excellent. I'm going to give you one other one because of my work and my background as a scholar in disability studies, and that is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was passed, it's federal law. It's being diminished, just so you know, on a state-by-state basis, which is dreadful. But it was passed in 1990, and it was passed after decades of activism, primarily by people with disabilities. So they mobilized, especially from about 1982 forward. And they determined that they wanted to get this legislation passed. One of the steps that precedes the approval of the ADA is the Capitol crawl, where literally people from all over the country came to the Capitol steps. And many of them had mobility impairments. They couldn't actually get up the stairs, which is one of the reasons they went there, because the actual built structure kept people with disabilities from entering it. So they mobilized. And they got the ADA passed. Here's what you need to know in terms of, is there a disability culture? A lot of people with disabilities, and by the way, I'm going to use disabled people and people with disabilities interchangeably. Most of us, I think, were taught person first language, but that's changed in the last 5 years. A lot of disabled people use identity first language. And if you're not sure what term to use, just ask, right? But if you have traumatic brain injury, your disability in your life is radically different than somebody who is deaf, than somebody who has clinical depression, than somebody who has paraplegia. My brother-in-law is a paraplegic, and what he has said is that he feels he has as much in common with people without paraplegia as he does with people who are quadriplegic. They're very, very different kinds of cultures. So I would say, though, that strategic essentialist politics really worked because it got the ADA passed. This doesn't mean that disability exists in a vacuum, and to go back to this intersectional context, I want to provide a little bit of data. 23% of people with disabilities live at or below the poverty level in the United States. They're one of the highest, most represented groups in poverty in this country. Environmental racism puts BIPOC people at greater risk of disability and illness, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. And Joseph Shapiro did an incredible expose a few years ago on people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. They are at much higher risk of sexual assault. Among women with intellectual disabilities, it's about 12 times the rate of people who don't have disabilities. And in general terms, it's 7 times. And this is a question that we have to ask, which is, why might this happen? And it's disabilities are often counting on a range of care providers, but also because in a Cartesian world where we tend to privilege reason above anything else, we tend not to believe people with intellectual disabilities, especially if they are not verbal. We tend to dismiss them. And so in terms of ableism, you've got to simply say we can't talk about ableism as if it's the same for all people. So we need to find common ground. Disability doesn't exist in a vacuum, and working collectively has real power. And the images that I included on the one side, Black Lives Matter, and on the other, disabled, queer, and here. But I want to say one word. I'll use an example. The Women's March a number of years ago in DC, millions of women marched. Isn't that great? We had one here in Pittsburgh as well. I have a friend who uses a wheelchair, and she wanted to participate in the march in Pittsburgh. She continued to call the organizers, and if you're amongst this group, sorry, and said, is the route accessible? I use a wheelchair, I have a service dog. Yeah, you'll be fine. 2 things happened. One was that the route, in fact, was not accessible. So as women continued to march, my friend had to find alternative routes by herself with her dog. And the second was, at one point, the crowds were so big that it was difficult for her to even navigate. So I think that this is something that the Women's March has organizers addressed after the first march. Probably not as well as they might have, but at least they started thinking about it. So I'm going to use an example, and this is the gender studies professor in me. So forgive me if I'm boring you or this is less interactive, but I want to ask a question. I teach about eugenics in my intro gender studies class, and what I've realized is that this is something that we aren't talking about. We're not talking about it in history classes and social science classes and our civics classes and our political science courses. We've largely erased it. So I want to use compulsory sterilization in a kind of intersectional context to talk about this. Anybody know what eugenics is? Anybody? Yeah.
I think it was the movement that not Hitler and the Nazis relied on when they were doing that.
Okay. Sid?
It
Let me
was
go back.
a scientific movement that started in the 1800s. I think with Charles Darwin, but I could be wrong about that part. That essentially assigned superiority to specific people based on their race.
Excellent. And in case people on Zoom couldn't hear what she just said, it was actually Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. And it was a pseudoscience of building a better breed, in essence. But what this meant, because most of the eugenicists were white, male, educated, straight, and able-bodied, their definition of a better breed was very, very specific. It was based on education, race, or the concept of race, which doesn't actually exist, location, etc. So it starts in the 1800s, and it's deeply racist, it's deeply ableist, it's classist, it's xenophobic. Negative eugenics targeted BIPOC, disabled people, people who were indigent or poor, and certain immigrant groups. And I want to just clarify, there are what are called positive and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics globally, one of the things that kills kids under the age of 5 is diarrhea. There are really easy ways to fix diarrhea, right? You hydrate kids. If it's parasitic, you give them clean water, you give them better food. Doing that is an example of positive eugenics. Negative eugenics is when you say, well, here's some traits that we want to breed out or get rid of. And so it's everything from compulsory sterilization to genocide. We aren't teaching about compulsory sterilization, even though it absolutely is a part of our fabric of our nation's history. Some data, just so you know, by 1976, 24% of Indigenous American women had been sterilized. According to a national fertility study conducted in 1970, 20% of unmarried Black women had been sterilized by 1970. And by about 1974, 35% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age had been sterilized. And my question is, why aren't we talking about this? Because you know it hasn't stopped, right? There is some evidence that at an ICE detention center, a nurse said that a doctor was sterilizing undocumented workers there. But it's also about, this is where it's intersectional, it's also about disability. Disabled people were targeted. And Bell v. Buck, 1927, legalized forced sterilization of patients at a Virginia home, set the groundwork and became a template for states throughout the United States to establish compulsory sterilization laws. Oliver Wendell Holmes was the Supreme Court justice who articulated the majority decision. I'm going to just read this quote. "It is better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for a crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit for continuing their kind," end quote. And just so you know, the Eugenicist Society of North America, there were some members of it who actually argued that the best way to keep, quote, imbeciles from reproducing was to simply kill them. And that's in our own country. 32 states passed eugenic sterilization laws during the 20th century. And Dee, I'm so glad that you mentioned, how many of you learned about Nazi genocide? Raise your hands. And if you're on the screen, I guess you can just kind of say, yes, I did. What you should know is that the Nazi scientists who practiced genocidal policies, they actually got their ideas from US eugenicists. There's a massive amount of exchange of information from eugenicists in California in particular, and Nazi scientists. And eugenics policies and data was funded by the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Institute. So vast corporations were involved, funded it, and actually contributed to Nazi scientists' efforts to eradicate Jewish people, Polish people, LGBTQ communities. And you should also know that the Nazis perfected their killing machines on people with disabilities. So what they did was they went into Germany, they emptied out the asylums and institutions for people with disabilities. They would take them 8 at a time to what they called their mobile killing vans. And they would experiment on what most effectively and efficiently killed them. At the end of the Second World War, these institutions and asylums had been emptied. So when we talk about the Holocaust, I think we need to really examine US complicity, but also the role of ableism in it. So it was really popular in the United States. It was taught in universities. They had eugenicist societies all over the country. So a question is, why might it have ended? And in fact, it hasn't necessarily. But post-World War II, with the discovery of genocide, a lot of Americans stopped supporting eugenics. But some other real reasons that are intersectional in terms of finding common ground is that the growth of the disability rights movement and the independent living advocacy basically said, stop sterilizing disabled people. Civil rights advocacy and Civil Rights Act of 1857 increased activism. And what African-American and Indigenous women started to realize was that they had in fact been subject to compulsory sterilization. It's actually one of the reasons why a lot of BIPOC women didn't initially support Roe v. Wade, because what they said is, there's an epistemology of ignorance. You haven't really learned about how we have been sterilized against our will. And finally, feminist movements generally started to say, wait a second, you can't simply sterilize people without their consent. So different social justice movements combined to stop compulsory sterilization, and in many cases, their work began to overlap and it fostered allyship. So I want to ask the question, what does allyship look like? What does that entail? Roxane Gay, who many of us know her work, love her stuff. This is from her essay on Making Black Lives Matter. Black people do not need allies. We need people to stand up, take on the problems born of oppression as our own, without remove or distance. We need people to do this, even if they cannot fully understand what it's like to be oppressed for their race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, class, religion, or other marker of identity. We need people to use common sense to figure out how to participate in social justice. I teach at a predominantly white institution, and my guess is that Duquesne is also a predominantly white institution. Many of us, if we're here today, especially in this classroom, it means that we are members of higher education communities. So we already have access to structural privilege. I would guess that, like at Slippery Rock, many of us are white, many of us present as straight, cis, and non-disabled. So a question I think that's really important is, how do we do this? How do we practice allyship? These are kind of extreme, and I know that they participate in a kind of gut thing, but on the left, we have images of police officers kneeling at a Black Lives Matter protest, and on the right, it's a pickup truck for people with visual impairments, big pickup truck, and it has on the back, not all country boys are bigots, happy Pride Month, with a rainbow flag. So how many of us want to participate in practicing allyship to find common ground? I mean, I'm guessing it's why a lot of us are here. So a question I want to ask is, before we start about how that might happen, what are some of the challenges of finding allyship? What are some of the challenges? Yeah.
I think that there's a balance you have to find when you're trying to be an ally to some kind of community or group that you don't personally identify with, between being able to help best without overpowering the movement that that community is particularly trying to undertake.
All right. And can people who are participating on Zoom, can you hear audience members or not? Can somebody unmute to let me know if that's possible?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Great. Thank you, Dee. Any other challenges that we might find when we want to participate in allyship? One is then, if we're not a member of a marginalized group, it's the danger of a kind of colonization of their voices, of speaking for instead of speaking with. I know that in disability justice circles, it's why a lot of people don't like Autism Speaks, because many of them feel that it speaks for autistic people rather than with them. Any other challenges that we might face when we're trying to think about finding common ground and participating in allyship? Yeah.
You want to make sure you're excuse me, allyship is not performative, that you're actually hoping to make a difference and not just say you're supporting a group to look better.
Excellent. Avoid performative allyship. It's just no good. Yeah, excellent. Great point. Anybody else?
I have one on
Okay.
Zoom. Sometimes it's hard to, this sounds terrible, but to like pick an issue. I find whenever I start to look into things, I get very overwhelmed with how much
Mhm.
needs to be changed or what I believe needs to be changed. And I don't know where to start a lot of the times.
I don't think that sounds dumb at all. I think that's an excellent point. How many of you, if you care about social justice, go to bed at night thinking, oh my God, I need 5 more hours just in this single day, right? I mean, at Slippery Rock, we had a program a couple of weeks ago on gerrymandering. And what I said at the end of the program, I went downstairs and said to my partner, well, there's another issue I've got to commit myself to. At which point he rolled his eyes and just said, oh my God, and probably had another beer, frankly. But how many of you think it's overwhelming? Sometimes it's difficult to determine where we want to place our energy and our focus. Excellent. Any others? Catherine?
Oh, I was just raising my hand in reflection of your question, but I was the one that said that.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Anybody else? If not, I want to talk a little bit again. This is review. Some of you have already begun it. What are some of the do's and don'ts of allyship? One of the things I think you should do, and this is what a couple of people have said, is know the issues and stay informed, including understanding historical context for structural bias and oppression. One of the things I say in my class a lot is absence has as much meaning as presence. We begin by talking about children's books. And one of the things that you find if you study children's books is that characters who are disabled, characters who are not white, characters who are fat, characters who are depressed are almost impossible to find in children's literature. I teach an essay by a woman, Taya Miles. She talks about working with a group of girls for 6 weeks in the summer. They're all girls of color, and they're rewriting Disney stories. And at the end, they decide to perform a play, and they say, who should play Cinderella? And they pick the single girl who most approximates whiteness. And when she says why, the girls say, none of us are princesses. And by the time they're 8, girls have already learned by watching Disney that if they're not represented, they don't really matter. So I think we have to read and interrogate absence as much as we do presence. And that's a simple way to say we need to be cognizant of epistemologies of ignorance. So Nancy Tuana, who is a feminist philosophical scholar, I should call her a legal scholar, she's a philosopher. She writes an essay, Coming to Understand, Orgasm and the Epistemology of Ignorance, that ignorance, like knowledge, it's actively created, it's maintained. The generation of ignorance is rooted in systems of oppression and power. So if we're not learning that Nazi scientists learned much of what they know from US eugenicists, that's an epistemology of ignorance we have to address. If you're not learning in your classes about the hundreds of thousands of people who were sterilized against their will, we are failing to really find common ground to make changes. So what we know and how we know it reflects a hierarchy of privilege. What we don't know or forget is embedded also in systems of privilege and forgetting. So being an ally means taking the time and effort to excavate epistemologies of both collective and individual ignorance. Yeah.
I also think one of the things that I personally struggle with is just trying to find out, I guess, when, well, it's taking the passive role. And like, when I'm not a part of this with this marginalized group, I guess it's more of like a, what can I learn from this and how can we all move forward, instead of like, personally, my thing is like, I want to fix it and I want to like move forward and I want to advocate for it. But taking that passive role, knowing that there's more to just what I see, and like being the passive person and like understanding that.
Yeah, one of the things that the think tank that we many of us say when we introduce ourselves is when we ask why are you here, the response is, I'm here to listen and learn. And I think that that's something that you are kind of getting at. One of the things COVID has taught me, I work in a lot of collective action-based organizations. This sounds so arrogant, but I'm going to say it anyway. What the heck? Have any of you ever participated in social justice work where you sat there or stood there and thought, I know what to do. I have the answer. Or am I the only one? What being in COVID, in the wake especially of George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter protests, and for me in the wake of sexual assault activism, is patience with the process. And there are times I sat in meetings where we tried to move towards collective collaborative consent. In my head, I've been screaming, frankly. But what I have found is that 2 months later or 3 weeks later, when we decide on an action, what I actually realized is, my God, this is so much better than anything I thought I knew, right? So I think that that's a really excellent point. It's how many of you also, I'm going back, Catherine, to what you said, find out that doing the research is sometimes just takes time. And you've got classes, you've got organizations, we're working, we've got families. There's so much other things, definitely other things that can take us away from that. But I really believe deeply that we need to do the research. There's a post-colonial feminist theorist, Gayatri Spivak, and in an essay she wrote called On Translation, she's writing about female genital cutting and how white feminists often present female genital cutting as the worst thing that could ever happen. And it happens primarily in Muslim countries. And what Spivak says is, know about the history, the religious context, the ritualistic context. Don't simply disparage it without knowing that historical context. And when I talk about female genital cutting, and I use the word cutting rather than mutilation, we actually do cross-cultural analyses, because when it's a white person critiquing female genital cutting, we tend to use terms like barbaric, deeply problematic. But we don't at the same moment talk about cosmetic enhancement surgeries in the United States, even though we know that more and more 18-year-old high school graduates are getting cosmetic surgery for graduation presents. What's the difference, right? So I think it's important that we do our homework and really know the ground. So what are some of the do's of allyships? And some of you already talked about this. Listen and learn. Take note of whose voices are absent. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? That's key. How many of you would actually say it's almost impossible to do entirely, right? Acknowledge your privilege, practice cultural humility. I want to go back to something that you said. We brought a woman to campus a couple of years ago, and she's African-American, and she was talking about structural oppression, right? White supremacy. And at the end, she was taking questions, and a young woman in the back who was white raised her hand, and she said, well, I always feel a little embarrassed. I don't want to acknowledge my white privilege because I think it might make my friends of color feel badly. And the speaker started laughing, and she said to the students of color in the classroom, she said, any of you mind if white people acknowledge their white privilege? And they all said, not at all, would be kind of nice. So I think sometimes it's important to recognize our privilege without centering it, right? Use your structural privilege when it's appropriate. Amplify and center marginalized voices before your own. And it's that question of speaking with or speaking after instead of speaking for. Work to recognize your implicit bias and to acknowledge and to see how you might participate in oppressive systems. You've got to see it before you can name it. You can't name your own participation in oppressive systems until you see them. Understand that it's a process. Remember that being an ally doesn't necessarily mean that you fully understand what it feels like to be oppressed. It just means you're taking on the struggle as your own. What are some of the allyship don'ts, do you think? Before I move to that slide, what are some things that you probably shouldn't do as an ally? Yeah.
I think like a really big problem with allies or people who identify as allies is they tend to like as the group. Just being a person of color and like having somebody tell you like how things should be done with like explaining on your behalf when you're already in the space is kind of like insulting. Again, like it's just talking over somebody. It isn't actually letting that person like mention their experiences. And again, like experiences are nuanced. They, you know, like as much as I might love my friends talking about like the racism and like, you know, being like anti-racist or talking about like the nuances of colorism, I don't really want to necessarily hear them talk about it in depth as if they were the person experiencing
allyship and the way that allies talk is that they tend to talk as if they're part of the group. And it's just like they're maybe aligned with the group, but you are not the group.
That's excellent. And I mean, this is this notion, it means taking on the struggle as your own, but also recognizing your outsider status. And I really think what you said is important, because what you don't want to do is lecture to people who might be experiencing intersectional oppression, because you don't have to. Zip it, right? Listen. It's a great point. So I think that that can be a hard balance to find too, right? But my thing is usually just to practice silence if you're not sure, right? Good.
I was gonna say, like, what before she just said it, like, don't be an empath and be just somebody who can sympathize and listen and be with, not like say, oh, like, I know how that feels. No, you don't. Like, you don't know. So like, that's one of the things that like shouldn't be like, shouldn't be an empath. You should just sit and observe.
Excellent. Yeah. You don't have to say, oh, I know, I had something like that happen too. Probably you didn't, but even if you did, maybe now is the time simply to listen. Don't center your own guilt. If someone is talking about sexism and you're a man, what you don't need to say is, oh, I feel so terribly I wish sexism didn't exist. Just don't. Yeah. Any others? Anybody from our Zoom audience? I see that there's some people saying things in chat. Okay. Okay. So don't do, and somebody said this, performative allyship or virtue signaling. Don't victim blame. Avoid tone policing. Well, you know, people might listen to you more if you would just X, Y, or Z. Don't expect people who are marginalized or oppressed to educate you. That is not their responsibility. If and when you do say something that is hurtful, discriminatory, or oppressive, and I know a lot of my friends who are trans get this a lot. They're misgendered, they're dead named. The best thing to do is to simply apologize without making a big deal about it. It's not about you. I love this line, apologies are social contracts that hold you accountable. They tell others that you're taking responsibility, are open to the consequences of your actions, and plan to do better in the future. Finally, don't quit. It's really exhausting, but have patience, practice humility, look at short and long-term goals. And I would say, try to balance resilience with self-care, because this is a couple people who pointed, this is exhausting work, really. So I had hoped that we would be in small groups and that there would be people in the room, but I want to try to address the hybrid issues. And this is something I'm really hoping that people who are still on Zoom will participate in. I want to close by trying to find a way to connect intersectional issues with finding common ground. So what I'd like to do, we won't work into small groups, but I'd like to brainstorm different intersectional issues there are two topics that I've very briefly organized. And then to discuss how might we organize different interest groups and allies to address and redress the issue. Try to come up with 2 or 3 specific steps that we might take at the following levels. At the individual level, what do you think we might do? And at the structural level, what might we do as a society? This doesn't make any sense. Give me a minute. So I want to have, there are 2 different cases. It's 11:53 if we get to both of them in the end, but I want to save about 5 or 10 minutes for questions at issue. One is the criminal justice system. And I wanted to recognize that a lot of people are not experts on the criminal justice system, but many of us recognize that it is a system that is broken. I find myself always wanting to use the phrase criminal injustice system, because too often when we put the words together, it seems like an oxymoron, frankly. Not always, but often. So here's some data. When we look at the criminal justice system, some of the issues that are intersectional that we might want to fix. Black Americans comprise 27% of all individual arrests in the United States. That's double the number of African Americans in the general population. 70% of pretrial releases require a money bond, placing low-income defendants at higher risk of being incarcerated for the crime of being poor. In Allegheny jails, over 80% of the people being held there are held because they couldn't pay their bail. They are literally there for the crime of being too poor to afford bail. People with intellectual disabilities experience inappropriate assessments for competency to stand trial. In many cases, they may not be competent to stand trial, but the assessment rubrics that are in place don't accurately measure that. Homelessness is the greatest predictor of involvement with the juvenile justice system. And since LGBT youth comprise 40% of the homeless youth population, they are at an increased risk of incarceration. And yet in the criminal justice stuff that I'm reading, I almost never see LGBTQ addressed specifically. Women in prison reports that 70% of women in prison are survivors or victims of domestic violence. 53% experience emotional, physical, or sexual abuse as a child. And they're 5 times more likely to have a mental illness when compared to women in the general population. So here's our challenge and our opportunity together and collectively. I'd like to take the idea of criminal justice and find common ground. Here are different populations which are disproportionately and disparately impacted. What is common ground? What are some steps we might take to solve the problem? And I really want to get at this at the individual and the systems-wide level. What are some things we can do? We've got a massive problem, and it is deeply intersectional. And what nobody said is that actually intersectional allyship and social justice advocacy is difficult because it's pretty messy, right? It really gets complicated. What are some things we might do? Here's our problem. What are some steps we might take? And let's start at the individual level. And I don't know, again, I don't know how many people are still on Zoom. We've got 10 people on Zoom. We've got about that number in this room. What do you think are some steps we might take?
I'm actually not sure about the individual level, but on structural or systemic level, if you were going to create some kind of like affinity group, like you were talking about, I think that you would just want to make sure that whoever's going to be at the head of that, like maybe you have a person of color and then a person who is homeless and then a person who is of the LGBTQ community, who are all part of that like steering committee kind of, so that while they're tackling this issue alone, because if you start to separate that issue into the individual groups, it's going to be a lot harder to gain traction and move the pendulum forward. But if you have a representative group of people who are ensuring that each one of their issues are being addressed within that more collective movement, you might have more of a chance to make systemic or structural change.
Excellent. So you want to think about who's at the table. And if you don't have people who might represent these different intersectional issues, you've got a group of people who, as you said, really are coming at it from the outside, right? So you might want to have returning citizens. You might want to have people who have been part of the juvenile justice system. You might want to have somebody from the LGBTQ community. You might want to have somebody who is a person of color. You might want to have somebody who has experienced intellectual disability and the justice system. So you bring them all together. It's a great point. We've got the group. I'll call it an advisory council. Let's just say that we've put this together. We've got a whole network of different partnerships that we've integrated. And I'm thinking actually of ACAR as a kind of model for this or template. Then what? And again, I want to go back to the individual level. So at the individual level, you've helped organize this, you've plugged yourself in, you're coming to the meetings. What else might you do at the individual level before we go to systems-wide? To tackle the problem of criminal injustice. Yeah.
I would say from a micro level, I would try and gather resources and make them more readily available to youth, especially who are in marginalized groups, and make it more accessible for them to get or to, I guess, create a relationship with somebody who can, who's in the same boat as them or was in the same, and kind of like gather off. I mean, because when you know somebody's there to support you, or there's somebody there who cares about you, it's a lot harder to make a bad decision or go down a path that's not good for you.
That's excellent. And I mean, actually, I think one of the things that you just said is ask questions and then listen. I mean, if we look at the foster care to prison pipeline, for instance, what we know, if we get high school teachers, get junior high teachers, get some elementary school, we know that if a kid is suspended more than 2 times, statistically, they're much more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So listen to 10-year-olds. They know worlds. And if we don't listen to them, we're failing them.
I would also say just talk to people and educate people, but especially those who are in a similar privileged place. Like for myself, I've never had direct contact with the criminal justice system. And even though I might identify as LGBTQ, that doesn't mean that I know what it was like to be an LGBTQ homeless or incarcerated. And so talking to other people who have also not had those experiences and letting them know why it's an issue and why it's something that I care about, even though I haven't been personally affected by it, and get those people on board and help turn them into allies too. Education and anecdotal experiences are important, I think.
I love that. I also think creating a space for people to share their stories. You know, the lives that we lead are largely based on the narratives that we decide to tell, we choose to tell about ourselves and others. Those are imminently revisable. And I think sometimes just giving people a chance to tell their story, to narrate their life is really empowering. Anything else at the individual level? Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, I think it's just for example, talking about like young incarcerated persons in particular, like there's one group around Karachi where they work directly with children who are the children of incarcerated persons. And like they have been around for like a little over, I think, a decade. But I think also just going directly to the source, because these are people who have actively, like, I think it was started by a group of people who experienced it, and then it was just like they wanted other children who were experiencing the same thing, having parents who were incarcerated, and you know, talking about recidivism rates, like that was already a space that was already established, and you know, it's nice to have advisory boards, but sometimes it's even better to just go directly against the source where impact is being made on such a personal level, where you're hearing, again, like you said, hearing the story directly from the person, but then that also gives you a better way to kind of see where you can build certain partnerships and see where you can advocate for the person so that maybe, because again, like you don't know who knows who, but in some instances, people have known like maybe city council persons on a personal level. So then because they network with those organizations, they can use the network on a city level where it's actually helped like influence certain policies. They try to maybe like introduce, I don't know, children to like the legal system in like a different capacity, maybe like having like attorneys actually listen to the experiences of those persons, because then it gives them a better grasp on like what do they need to change in their policy making, what do they need to change from like a personal level whenever they're handling cases. I think that's probably like a good way to go about it.
I love that. So, and Machi's a great example because go to the source. I mean, don't reinvent the wheel. But more than that, I think what you're really saying is listen to those who have lived experience, whether that's people who have been in the criminal justice system or their families, their communities, their friends, make their experience central to the work that you're doing. And that really is about, too, not going in and having your own idea of how to fix it. I would add to that, check your implicit bias. I've been doing research on Louisiana's criminal justice system specifically. It's amazing and actually kind of appalling. But the number of people, when we did the panel on Slippery Rock on criminal injustice, I had students come up to me afterwards who I've never met say, wait a minute, people are in jail because they can't pay bail? I thought the only reason that people were put in jail was because they were found guilty of a crime. Right? So know your data and know your own implicit biases. You can't assume that just because the Supreme Court has presented criminal justice as unbiased and objective, that's the reality. What about at the structural level? What might we do to rethink the criminal justice system collectively to find common ground, to challenge some of the worst problems? Let's just solve the world's problems in the next 15 minutes. Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure how to like word this, but like making it more equitable for people who don't have the resources that other people do. I mean, there was just a huge car accident where a woman died and her dog died from an NFL player who killed her on 127 miles per hour on impact. And he got out of jail so fast because he had the money to pay for it. Yeah. And that seems like it's a trend to have rich celebrities getting off on, you know, the easy, or I guess because they have the money to do it, they have the resources, they can pay for a whole team of lawyers and the best lawyers to get them out of whatever situation they're in, which is great. But then you have people who don't have anything and who can't even, you know, provide the bond that they need to get out of jail and then get a lawyer too, or then, you know, so providing these resources for people at a more affordable and, you know, equitable fashion, that would make it more fair.
That's excellent. A really good point. And it's not equitable. In Pennsylvania at prison, if I need a public defender, depending on the county, our county budgets are helping to pay for our public defenders. That means if I live in Beaver Falls or Newcastle, that I am likely to get a public defender and it will be less funded than it might be if I lived in, say, Sewickley. And so we need to do away with county funded public defender systems, period. That would be one system-wide change. Dee, you had your hand up.
Something else I think we need to work on is for like the organizational level. I know a lot of nonprofits will do work in these areas to provide resources. And what you said about not reinventing the wheel, I think that one thing we need to do is learn how to work together. There's a lot of infighting that happens, I think, in nonprofits. And a lot of that is competing for the same funding sources. Sometimes it's personality conflict, whatever it might be, or just a different idea about how to go about tackling those issues. I think ACAR, like you mentioned earlier, does a really good job of figuring out how to not reinvent the wheel and not compete for those funding sources and alleviate some of that. But I think that's in general a huge problem that needs to be addressed, is the infighting on these issues, because we're not going to be able to make change if we're not only fighting the issue, but ourselves.
Right. And so trying to avoid turf issues, right? Kind of turfism is a major challenge and opportunity. Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, at least for homelessness, because again, that's not something that's usually federally protected as much. I think maybe, like, again, you can probably lobby on behalf of people who are experiencing homelessness, like on the federal level, you can lobby on their behalf by stating that there should be like state funding allocated explicitly for that. Because again, it is really up to the state. And also just like federal guidance for it. I think that would be something, because again, if we're reducing homelessness, because that is like a really, really big factor, especially for like younger persons, especially for LGBTQ, like these are probably the biggest obstacles for them. And then again, trying to advocate for funding, like increased funding for like certain like groups like what is it, Proud Haven, something like that, where they can actually like receive more federal funding rather than, or even if it's possible for them to receive like private funding, but expanding that a little bit more.
So excellent. And again, I want to repeat some of what you just said, because for people who are joining us via Zoom, in terms of homeless populations, people experiencing homelessness in the criminal justice system, federal allocation of funding to address that, federal legislation so that a renter cannot turn away someone simply because they are homeless or a returning citizen. We might reallocate our federal budgets. It's a really excellent point. There was something else that you said that I wanted to specifically comment on. Oh, in terms of federal allocation of funding, 25% of the nation's homeless people live in California. So another way to think about it would be to think about per capita, right? Because California realistically should receive far more funding than North Dakota, right? If we want to reimagine something like that. Anybody on Zoom want to chime in? Do I have to 12:30? Anybody from Zoom want to chime in? Because I want to move to the second case kind of scenario to continue this practice, not to be redundant, but to really continue to expand and kind of work together. Anybody from Zoom want to chime in?
I actually heard that one of the reasons that California's homeless population is so great is that other states will actually like ship their homeless to California instead of creating the infrastructure to help support the homeless. Do you know if that's true or not?
I don't know if that's true or not. I have no data to provide evidence that says states are shipping people who are experiencing homelessness to California. I know that some of the reasons is that California's climate permits it. Highway 5 provides this incredible one road move. So if you're homeless in Siskiyou County in Northern California, you can get on a bus or hitch a ride on 5 and end up in Southern California, where it will be warm in December in about 15 hours. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to California having a higher incident of people who are homeless. I'm not sure. I'll have to do some research. And Caitlin, I'll give you my email and I'll let you know. Anybody else know? Is there any data on that?
Well, it's also, I feel like the cost of living is so much higher in New York and California, and that causes people to not be able to afford the kind of living that is needed to be comfortable.
Excellent. And that's been exacerbated by COVID. Yeah, especially Dee.
I'm gonna have to look more into it, but it does say that there are homelessness relocation programs. But I think that they have to agree to them. I'm just looking this up now, but the Guardian says they do exist.
Okay, so Caitlin, you may be right. I'll do more research and get back to you in the next tomorrow. Dee, thank you for starting that. Well, I want to move to a second example that we might consider, and that is health disparities. Some data to get you started. In the United States, the maternal death rate for Black women is more than 2 times higher than for white women. And that's true for Black infant mortality rates as well. Black women and children are dying in this country, and it is an epidemic, and we're not screaming about it, which is fascinating to me. Food deserts in the United States are concentrated in low-income and minority neighborhoods, and they correlate to higher incidence of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, and residents in those neighborhoods. And one of the things that we know about food deserts is that one of the easiest ways to fix it is to simply create legislation so that Giant Eagle or Whole Foods cannot simply locate in upper or middle class neighborhoods. But a second is to provide transportation. So if you live in a food desert, here's a really easy fix. Provide transportation so they can get to the Giant Eagle or the Aldi's that they might need, or the Dollar General or whatever. But we're not doing that. HIV infection rates are highest in the United States for Black men who are gay and bisexual, as high as 32% in some places, with multiple barriers to medical aid. That can be if you live in the Bible Belt. It can be because in the public imagination, we imagine the gay community as white. So if you are a Black, gay, or bisexual man and you come out, you risk losing your community, both if you are living in an African-American neighborhood and being not included in white gay neighborhoods. In Atlanta, Georgia, there are still race segregated gay bars, for instance, which is fascinating to me. There are predictions that in the next 10 years, if we don't make a change, the United States in the South, we will have the highest rates of HIV infection in the world. And that's appalling, because we know that we can fix that. There are disparately high infection rates of COVID-19 among undocumented workers, and that's true as well for poor people, for people of color, and for people with disabilities. And finally, 13% of Black children have asthma compared to only 8% of white children. It's often triggered by air pollution and emissions from factories. So we know that environmental racism is a factor. If you look at cancer alleys in the United States, they're almost always located in poor neighborhoods that are oftentimes minoritized as well. So we have a lot of different issues. When we think about health disparities, what are some ways that we might address this? And again, I want to start at the individual level. Knowing that health disparities is a massive problem, what might you do? What might I do? What might each of us do at an individual level to begin to address this problem? Yeah.
I'm only saying this because my sister, her research was actually in maternal health for Black women, especially during pregnancy, and all of these things, especially for that HIV and asthma, they come more so from the medical field itself, because we there is internationally speaking, there is anti-Blackness sentiment and just anti-person of color. So it's kind of hard to tackle that on an individual level, because again, it's so subjective. The way that doctors approach patients is very subjective, and it's very hard to determine how they would actually treat those persons. Because again, like they're amongst their peers and people state certain things. So it's kind of like harder to regulate. And we can have like people advocate for themselves, but at the same time, like if the person who's prescribing the treatment isn't actually like listening to them, there really isn't much they can do to actually enforce that. And people can try to report like medical professionals to boards and stuff like that, but at the same time, there's no guarantee that that's going to happen in a timely fashion. So with these things, like it's kind of hard because even though like an individual people know that these things are happening and they can contribute financially to certain groups and entities at the same time, like most of the things that are issues here need to be like treated by a certain group, and that individually and systemically is too difficult to kind of like handle because again, like HIV, I mean, destigmatizing HIV in like the Black community has already been difficult, but getting treatment for HIV has been even more difficult for Black people. Like testing centers are kind of like out of the way. Again, there has been like a reform of the way that we approach HIV and AIDS, which is like good and bad because we don't talk about it in a disparaging sense, but at the same time, we don't really talk about it. Like, for instance, Allies for Health and Wellbeing in Pittsburgh was actually formerly Pittsburgh AIDS and HIV Task Force. And they did testing, they did all of the proper resources, they helped like patients actually get really cheap medication, but when they were kind of like given new leadership, they kind of reformed themselves and no longer were about HIV and AIDS task based initiatives. It then became like something completely different. It was kind of co-opted in a sense. And they helped a lot of the people that were suffering from it around here, but then it became like something that was less specific. And in a sense, like that's good, but at the same time, that's bad too, because again, we're harming communities by doing that. So like, even though there might be initiatives taken, they can be co-opted, and then there's also like medical mistreatment.
So I'm going to go back to that. You just said a lot of excellent, really thoughtful stuff that I'm just going to be processing for a while. I want to start with one of the last things you said, and it goes back to strategic essentialist politics. If the HIV task force in Pittsburgh has changed, it's morphed, and maybe there's some benefits, but maybe also it's left out people who are HIV positive or risk being HIV positive. Maybe we practice strategic essentialist politics to make that a priority, right? Because then it's centered again, and only then can we perhaps go back to what we need to do, which is to better address the fact that HIV lives in our backyard, right? But the other thing I wanted to say in structural terms about your first statement, that medical providers are often, they're part of the problem, right? And oftentimes it's based on implicit bias. How's this for one possible answer? And data on implicit bias says it's almost impossible to completely change it. But what we can do is become more cognizant of our own implicit bias and change our behaviors and our responses to it. And that's effective. What about if we rethought our whole medical school curriculum? And what we did was we integrated not 1 week, not one semester, not one class on implicit bias, but we wove that throughout all of the curriculum. What if we talked about disability not as a condition to be cured, but a culturally constructed condition or existence? What if we talked about the need for all physicians, nurses, nurse techs, etc., to be culturally competent? It doesn't negate what you said, because I think what you said is true. A lot of medical staff are going to have access to privilege. But it might make me, if I'm ER, less likely to turn away somebody who's Black on the assumption that they're practicing drug-seeking behavior. It might mean that if someone who is intellectually disabled comes to me and says, somebody touched me in a way that made me feel icky, rather than say, that person would never do that, I know her, I might say, I'm going to listen to what you have to say. So we could rethink our medical school curriculum, and we could actually start doing this earlier. Most of us have some kind of healthcare class, even as early as high school or junior high. Why not make an intersectional analysis of health disparities part of our public school curriculum K through 12? we only have 10 minutes left. We're not done at all, but I want to save 10 minutes for questions. There are still folks who are joining us on Zoom. It's always kind of weird in a hybrid event like this to be a Zoomie, so to speak, because you're both visible and invisible. Questions and thoughts. That's actually my last slide. I'm happy to make this available to anybody if you want some of my references. Oh, that's not what I wanted. I'm going to stop the share. But I wanted to ask then, are there any questions for people before we wrap up? Any comments? Yeah.
I really like what you said about like the medical aspect of just everything. I mean, the medical model is so prevalent. Like, I feel like no matter what, we all kind of experience it in a different kind of way. And it is true, there's just such mistreatment and it is a systemic problem down to the fault, like that doctors are treated or they're taught, I guess, to look at a person's body as a robot and try and fix what that problem is rather than looking at what societal factors there are outside and what that could be causing for that person. And it is truly like a huge thing. That's a huge problem, especially in like terms of a mental health perspective. Like there are physiological things that can be caused throughout your body that are caused from stress and that are caused from environmental factors that no doctors ever seem, or very rarely ever seem to take into account when diagnosing you with something or treating you. So I think changing that curriculum is the first step to really becoming more of a humanistic and more of a doctor-patient as a collaborative rather than doctor here, patient passive.
Excellent. And the other thing is we've got to do different kinds of research. There's a condition which I suspect you're referencing. It's called weathering. And it's applied primarily to people of color in this country. And it's the notion that being exposed to chronic racism, to chronic stress, it actually ages you more quickly. And one case I want to share with you is that usually young women are discouraged from getting pregnant for all sorts of reasons, but one is that it's more dangerous to have a child if you're a young woman, right? Typically, if you're over the age of 20 or 22, your chances of carrying that pregnancy to end are higher. That's true for white women. A lot of research has actually shown that Black women who get pregnant later have a higher risk of complications, risk, and death. And the question is, wait, why would that be? It's actually suggesting that their bodies are so damaged by weathering, by chronic exposure to structural racism, that it complicates their maternity. But that's been left out of the data almost completely. So other things that you think we should think about before we wrap up this session on finding common ground in an intersectional context? That's a great point. And I really like what you said too. If not, I think we'll wrap up. I want to thank people for joining me today. Now we just need to go out and change the world. That's our homework for tomorrow. All right. Thank you so much. And thanks, Sid and Dee, for having me.
I just want to thank everybody for coming today. Thank you so much to Cindy for that wonderful talk. I think you gave us a lot of things to think about and a good challenge to start off our week with. I hope that everybody will be able to attend this afternoon session at 1:30 p.m. Either in person or on Zoom. That will be a talk led by Dr. Jessica Mann from the Center for Community Engaged Teaching and Research. And it will feature a number of student leaders from Duquesne University. So thank you once again for coming, and we hope to see you again this week.